What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Comrades Classroom podcast. This month, our community took time to study concepts and frameworks that have emerged out of the queer liberation movement, and especially those that were grounded in the revolutionary tradition of Marsha P. and Sylvia Rivera. On this episode, we play back a brilliant book talk on Eric A. Stanley's book, Atmospheres of Violence, Structuring Antagonism and the Trans-Queer Ungovernabl. The discussion was put on by the Othering and Belonging Institute. You can find the full video on YouTube and in our show notes. We are asking our listeners to show support for this episode by donating to the LGBTQ Books to Prisoners program. Thank you for your support. Everything for everyone, nothing for ourselves. Free the land.
Excuse me, everyone, I have a brief announcement to make. Jesus was black, Ronald Reagan was the devil, and the government is lying about 9/11. Thank you for your time and good night.
No! That can't be true!
Ow!
You're having that dream where you made the white people riot, weren't you?
But I was telling the truth.
How many times have I told you you better not even dream about telling white folk the truth? You understand me? Shoot. Making white people riot. You better learn how to lie like me. I'm gonna find me a white man and lie to him right now.
I am the stone that the builder refused. I am the visual, the inspiration that made ladies sing the blues. I'm the spark that makes your idea bright. The same spark that lights the dark so that you can know your left from your right. I am the ballad in your box, the bullet in the gun, the inner glow that lets you know to call your brother son. The story that just begun, the promise of what's to come. And I'ma remain a soldier till the war is won. Chop, chop, chop. Chop, chop, chop.
Thank you so much, Courtney and everyone. So I want to start out by thanking all the behind-the-scenes labor that's happening and is continuing to happen to make this come off, including Robin, Mark, Christian, again, Jillian, as well as the entire department who has been deeply supportive of me and my work over the years. I'd also, of course, like to thank the panelists, Lavelle, Jules, Dean, and Angela, and our amazing moderator, Courtney. I'm extremely humbled by your participation and grateful for your enduring friendship. I should also say that Angela has been witnessing the unfolding of this project for more than 15 years. Some of this writing first appeared in graduate seminars that she was instructing a very long time ago. So thank you. I want to especially thank my family, grown from Santa Cruz and San Francisco, and the various movements and collectives that have welcomed me and continue to teach me everything I know. This book is, as I say in the dedication, for those lost to the world and all who remain as its antagonism. I want to briefly shout out 3 sites of struggle and ways we might support them. Right. I'm also speaking from occupied Ramaytush Ohlone land. Our support must be more than symbolic, so I invite you all to join the struggle to save the West Berkeley Shell Mound on University and 4th. It's an ongoing struggle. I think we'll include a link. The proceeds, the author's proceeds from this book, like my other books, are going to go to the LGBT Books to Prisoners project, right? Because one of the primary things that people ask for that are incarcerated are more materials. And so any way that we can lend our solidarity, I think, is really vital. So join me in supporting LGBT Books to Prisoners or other Books to Prisoners projects. And also the campaign to free Ashley Diamond, who is one of the imprisoned theorists that I think with in the book. So that's also an ongoing campaign that, again, we all should support. And, you know, of course, November 2nd is always a historical day in this place misnamed the United States, not because of any elections, but because it's the anniversary of Assata Shakur's escape from prison. So I want to mark that as well. So I'm going to read just a few excerpts from the coda of the book, so the very end of the book. And it starts with 2 quotes. And the first is, "I'm not a liberated woman. I'm a transgender woman, and I'm working on becoming liberated as we speak." And that's from Miss Major, who is our dear friend and comrade. She's also dealing with some health issues right now. And so if we can all send her some healing light and energy, that would be much appreciated. The second quote is from Tourmaline, and it's easy to be free. It's easy to be alive. So for some context, the beginning of this coda is attentive to the legal designation of ungovernability that often gets levied against trans and queer youth of color who live in and as refusal. So ungovernability then is both a sign of the law structuring cruelty and also perhaps a trapdoor out of it. I too was an errant youth. By the age of 14, I had already been expelled from school for the second and final time. I was charged with truancy, which was the name they gave my attempt to escape the extended torment of public education. It was then, as it is now, much easier to banish the survivor and to produce us as the problem of our own making than it is to confront violence's grind. My chronic absence was narrated as disruptive, not because I was actively distracting others, but because I exposed the fragility of that which kept us in class by escaping it. Indeed, their fear was not for me, a fact they emphatically confirmed, but that I might serve as referent for others to join us beyond the school's administration. My refusal to adhere to the lockdown of normativity's drive, expressed as unavoidable injury, was both the punishment for my escape and the catalyst for its persistence. Alone, together, the materiality of my survival was never singular. The intimacy of aid, a sofa, free food, a place to be when there was no other, offered a wayward community, however transitive. Without transcendence, we can't disregard violence's endurance, nor assume flight is always an option. Yet here, I want to hold the beloved networks of care that have helped us learn, as Tourmaline affirms that, quote, "It's easy to be free." In the quake of her evocative precision, we know our undoing has not been undone. On the contrary, it continues to intensify. Nonetheless, radical dreaming affords us a space of ease, which is how we might learn to feel freedom. Among the figures whose freedom dreams have allowed for our shared endurance in a world that wishes otherwise is Miss Major. In the 1990s, Major was working at the Tenderloin AIDS Resource Center as a street-level service provider for low-income people in the neighborhood. She drove the outreach van and helped run the needle exchange program that provided clean syringes and other supplies to anyone who asked. Needle exchanges were then, and continue to be, semi-legal operations where direct action and mutual aid meet in the communal knowledge that distributing resources without expectations keeps us alive. Major is multiple. She's a Black trans woman by way of the South Side, by way of Deep East, now Little Rock. In the aftermath of at least 2 bloody uprisings, she was radicalized by Attica survivor Frank Big Black Smith in Dannemore Prison and on the streets outside the Stonewall. She is the maternal sign for many whose first mothers lost them. Her stories of survival, hooking, and boosting collect a wild history where getting by without getting got grows an ecology beyond the formalism of the state. Sinuous scams, fraudulent documents, and ever-changing identifications, her life on the run brought the world with her. Anarchism in action. Here, ungovernability is not a scene of drifting chaos where power's account for survival always cuts along difference. That is democracy. It is an organized yet improvisational practice in common that revels in pleasure and expropriation, whose aim is to collectivize exposure towards that exposure's abolition. Major's perpetual interruptions and illicit practices, the way she grows a Black trans social life in the ruins of the white world, unsettles the stone precision of the state's biometric drive. This, with the unruliness of trans queer youth who reject the corporal discipline of education and the emptiness of home, undoes the pledge of incremental personhood. While the scale at which revolutionary change most often becomes known might miss these minor acts, it is their building of another end of the world, while also allowing for life to fill it, that reminds us we never struggle alone. Together, our anti-authoritarianism is a force that wildcats the state in the covert practices of skipping school, jumping turnstiles, and counterfeiting documents. Underground, we creep undetected through the dark alleys of recognition and below the frames of democracy's security cameras. While this book has dwelled for perhaps too long in the space of death, I end with the ungovernable, not because such practices negate violence, but because we, those who go on, must hold this incommensurability. If abolition's generativity names a presence of the world as much as it labors to end the one we cannot survive, then ungovernability not only refutes the state, it also figures the ease of living now. This is not to lay claim to the diminishing of modernity structuring antagonism. If anything, this is an unfinished experiment in collective action, a recursive dream that builds on itself, as pedagogies of rebellion always do. Yet, even in the place of trans queer celebration that is majors laugh, we return to the banks of the River Jordan, where we await Marsha, Sylvia, and all the others who were stolen from a world that could not bear their opulence. It is in this atmosphere of violence where getting ungovernable is both a trace of and a map for becoming liberated as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that beautiful reading. It's one thing kind of reading the words and sitting with them by myself, but then hearing you read them, I just have a completely different experience of the work. It's such a triumph on so many levels, aesthetically, analytically. There's so much to get into. So with that, I want to just go ahead and move into our questions. I have a few questions I'd like to pose to our panelists and then try to leave plenty of room for conversation with our audience. I'm sure people are going to want to really dig into this work. So I wanted to start out, there was a question that Eric and I kind of crafted together, and that I want to maybe begin with you, Professor Davis, and get your thoughts on this, and then invite other panelists to comment on this as well. But there's a quote in the beginning of the book, in the introduction, that says, "We're living in a time of LGBT inclusion. This is evidenced, at least in the United States, by the legal expansion of marriage, lesbian and gay military recruitment, and the proliferation of LGBT characters in popular visual culture. Against the narrative arc of rainbow progress that proclaims that these changes mark a radical shift in the social, Atmospheres of Violence argues that inclusion, rather than a precondition of safety, most properly names the state's violent expansion," end quote. Given the most recent wave of anti-trans legislation and cultural attacks, how might we think about the sort of quote unquote incorporative exclusion that Eric argues throughout the book? And I was also really thinking about this in relationship to more recent work by Kim Tallbear and the ways that she talks about how, this sort of desire to perfect this settler colonial state, that we have to accept on a certain level that settler colonial democracy cannot be sort of decolonized. And so, I think Eric is making a kind of similar argument in terms of how we should think about anti-trans violence as a sort of constitutive feature of the democratic state, so that inclusion, like representation, is fundamentally a trap. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and offer your thoughts on that argument, Professor Davis.
You're muted, Angela.
Thanks. That's a perpetual notice. You're muted, Angela. Well, first of all, let me say that Eric has really offered us this phenomenal gift. And thank you so much, Eric. And thank you for the reading. I, too, was very moved by the reading aloud. Having read the book silently, it acquires a very different kind of life when you speak the words. This book urges us to unlearn and rethink in ways that can hopefully potentially create the kinds of ruptures that we need to experience and to think and especially to feel. Atmospheres of violence ask us to try to begin the process of loosening our ties to foundational ideas that always keep us glued to ways of thinking that inevitably reproduce what we think we're fighting against. And I was thinking, earlier today I attended a DEI meeting, diversity, equity, inclusion, where I heard someone talking about the importance of integrating a particular program that is still all white. And it's so distressing the ways in which these vocabularies accumulate, vocabularies that militate precisely against the work that we think that we're doing. When I first met Eric many years ago, and I couldn't remember exactly how many, but he says it was 15 years ago. And Eric was a first-year student in history of consciousness. And I remember so vividly your persistent critiques of assimilative gay movement strategies, gay marriage, gay equality in the military, etc. And those critiques seem to so perfectly recapitulate the emphasis on integration as the goal of Black freedom struggles. Integration, incorporation, as long as the larger structures themselves remain relatively intact. So I am so thankful for this work that asks us to understand how Black trans women of color, take us to the limits of such inclusion, and therefore begin to lay the groundwork for more fundamental critiques of democracy itself. There's a lot that I could say, but I think that right now I'm just going to end by saying I really love the fact that this book undoes the major strategies for addressing racism, misogyny, homophobia, trans misogyny. And you have made me think more deeply about this question than I ever have before. So thank you very much, Eric.
And anyone else who'd like to speak to that question, please feel free to do so.
I would be totally happy to speak to it a little bit, and also just to echo, my profound sense of gratitude. I felt very moved reading the book, and also felt that feeling of it being a gift, and also a kind of call and an overdue in many ways reckoning, maybe inside the academy, but a reckoning that has been in progress for a very long time in many places in the world. And there, as much as there, I think, is a sense of mourning and loss throughout the text, there's also a sort of electricity to the possibility of leveraging, the structuring antagonism that the book takes up, to understand that we really already do have the tools that we need to understand how to live now, right? And I think that one of the narrative tendencies I really appreciate is this kind of disruption of the sort of utopian longing for the future that will repair either the damage of the past or the insufficiency of the present, and this sort of radical interruption of that to say that for those of us who are alive right now, we're not willing to mortgage ourselves for a fantasy of a future that will never be delivered. And so thinking about, anti-trans legislation, particularly the kind of intensity or the stack of it this year, and so much of it targeting women and trans kids. I mean, it's, really trans women and trans children that are bearing this brunt. But actually, I think one of the things that this book really helps us think about is the profound inability of kind of mainstream liberal pro-trans political movements to make any kind of affirmative defense of transness. I mean, I still profoundly think we have yet to encounter a single affirmative desire that children be trans, that women be trans, that trans people of color be in the world, any sort of wish that they would walk this earth. And so I think we've seen, just sort of, to my mind, some of the most disheartening attempts to oppose, of course, really horrific legislation, but on the most conservative terms possible. And I think that this book gives us the perfect kind of set of analytics to understand how, for instance, the way that trans childhood is being politicized right now, the ostensibly pro-trans side of that political struggle is really doubling down on one of the worst products of American culture, which is the idealized white protectable child, and this sort of idea that there is, a disproportionately upper middle class suburban white trans child who is in peril of losing access to a very, very rarefied, expensive form of healthcare, has really, I think, sort of led to a kind of doubling down on the sort of worst model, and really it's a sort of, this kind of model of begging the state for the most limited form of recognition as a kind of private citizen. And also this demand that trans youth, and I'm so glad, Eric, that you read from the coda, this demand that trans youth be placed back in the family. That as if, that to me is the only historically novel thing we're witnessing right now about trans childhood. There's nothing new about trans kids, but the idea that they belong in families, and that's the best place for them is, I just think, shocking to any of us who grew up trans. And also it serves this sort of purpose of completely depoliticizing and never hearing from those youth. And I think one of the things that I've been the most concerned about, and I feel such a greater kind of clarity about having read this book, is the sort of bait and switch here, this kind of mobilization in defense of a fantasized trans child in need of protection, is really a way of continuing to avoid the vast majority of trans youth who, frankly, don't have the privilege of being kicked out of a gender clinic and are much more likely to already be subject to forms of policing and incarceration. And that really is our trans youth of color, who are already, where basically transness and gender nonconformity is taken as an accelerant in a much older school to prison pipeline, and where transness is in fact denied, but its lack of recognition doesn't mean that it could be solved by inclusion, because it's already being folded into systems that, take gender non-normativity as evidence of deservingness to be, further policed or further, dispossessed, from a young age. So I really worry that this sort of, all of the kind of bad faith and red herrings of the current moment are serving, just as much as they're serving the hands of fascism, are also serving the kind of regeneration of liberalism at the moment when its sort of wail is most unconvincing and exhausted. And I really kind of worry how many, of those ungovernable Black and brown trans youth are going to be sacrificed at the altar of this dead fantasy of liberalism, and this idea that, lawsuits or whatever, that sort of liberal political institutions can somehow be leveraged at the last second to bail us out. So, I think that what Eric kind of does so brilliantly in this book doesn't read that, as just a sort of statement of pessimism, but rather understands that there really is a whole dynamic world, and that energy, that power of the ungovernability, right? That moment where dispossession and threat and violence and security and police sort of can, sort of metamorphose into that electric feeling of collectivity, is something that is just totally missing, I think, from our political imaginary. And I guess the last thing I would say, and one of the things I really appreciate about this book, is it gives us instruction on how to face what feels like the end of the world and demand that the world end on better terms and demand something as big as the violence that we are being met with in this moment, something bigger and more capacious than a return to a fantasy of normal that never existed. And I really think that we need not just the rhetoric of that or the analytic, but the affect, the feeling, right? And the sense of solidarity and intimacy that is really enlivening, and I think helps us follow the wisdom in Tourmaline's meditation on how it's, in fact, surprisingly easy to be alive and easy to be free. So in that spirit, thank you all for being here tonight. And I know I certainly feel that kind of intimacy and solidarity with each of you. So thanks so much for having us, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
I can go next, if that's all right. Just to echo what Jules and Professor Davis have already said, this book that Eric has given us has so many different things. It's definitely a blueprint for a method of thinking that will be extremely needed and necessary for folks working in the fields that we do, both academic and activist as well. And since affect kind of was the last thing that Jules hit on, I guess I'll hit on that. And for me, what really marks this book as a fantastic, though difficult read, is the overwhelming weightiness, the overall weighty affective charge that it has throughout, encountering these multiple scenes of gruesome, excessive violence, overkill, and all that. And I think that there's a way that, despite the weight that one might feel when reading, and the sense of despair, or the sense of, frustration, almost of how do we get out of this? I know as a scholar and someone working in communities, I often take that thinking approach of, well, what do we do? And I think in addition to giving a really talented and beautiful and evocative narration of how structures of power actually use violence in particular ways, how it specifically gets mobilized for what ends in service of whose power structure. I think that the book does a good job doing that, and also gives us a lens for how we can continue to think about those types of issues in overlapping and intersecting communities. Thinking about queer and trans people here specifically, and I love how Eric does a wonderful job of seamlessly allowing the reader to understand that it's not just, queer and trans people written perfectly exactly, but also all swaths of communities of people who are marginalized and disenfranchised, and who need access to and benefit from any kind of gains that are made for the community, which can be both positive in forms of mutual aid and community support, and also a bit more negative in terms of things like, the nonprofit industrial complex, or charity, or, those other self-serving kind of, sources of power that try to help people in communities. So, and thinking about the incorporative inclusion that was embedded in that first question, the book is actually helpful to me, not only while I'm writing my dissertation right now, so it of course has that value there, but it's getting me to totally rethink and readjust the epistemological and ontological ways that I've been thinking about not only trans and queer people on their own terms, but how within the context of global racial capitalism and neoliberalism and the carceral state, like how do the relationships and connections that people have in communities, despite these professed identities that are always ours to claim along gender and race and class, but what more than that, what beyond that is happening that constantly gets these kinds of people and these kinds of communities tripped up? And so with Eric offering the term incorporative exclusion, and reading that in the book, it reminded me of a concept that I'm working with and working through in my project. Right now, I have it written, it's a term called regimes of unprotection, which is an intentional riff off of what police in our country, have their claim as their normal motto to protect and serve. And in trying to find out and locate the contradictions and the mismatches that happen when we go into the archive and try to see how trans people and queer people, queer people of color get treated by the state in its many different forms, we see overwhelmingly, and even especially here in the book, detailed these instances of violence, humiliation, just demonstrations of power that clearly shows out that there are intentional people and groups of people who are not meant to receive the full, the full right or the full care that institutions that we live in are able to give and clearly can give. So this willingness to include what's around you, but actually to exclude them because of how that process is being navigated, I think gives us a lot to think about. Not only with the kinds of mobilizing that we'll do moving forward, but also just how we think about the modes of violence and the scenes of violence that we are always wrapped up in and living in, and how do we find a way to think creatively, to imagine, to resist or disidentify. Like, I think it gives us a good platform from which to produce some really solid response to the state in all those forms.
This is such a fun conversation. It's so fun to hear you talk about this Lavelle in relationship to your dissertation, which I'm very excited about. And yeah, I mean, it's so delightful to read this book after feeling like Eric has been influencing my thinking, one of the main people influencing my thinking for so many years now and teaching me so much, and then get to read the crystallization in the book, of like all of that. And I think Eric's language, as we heard with like the reading aloud at the beginning, is just like so beautiful and evocative, and there's so many phrases I've like underlined that just are like, oh, I could never say this quite, it's just it's really such an offering. And I love this question and this phrase, incorporative exclusion. Like, to me, when I thought about this question, I thought about how like this process of mainstreaming that we've seen with like gay politics and then later trans politics is like this process in which the national narrative comes to be that the state protects these people. And that happens a lot through things like, hate crime laws and other, marriage or whatever, all the things that Eric's work has critiqued in so many different brilliant ways for so long. And then like, meanwhile, the conditions on the ground for people like who are harmed by homophobia and transphobia, like don't get better at all. They actually get worse because it's happening at the exact same time that like the prison system is endlessly growing and like the immigration enforcement system is endlessly growing and the wealth divides are endlessly growing. And so it's like this, it feels like especially queer and trans, like sort of like the kind of conservative queer and trans politics that's most visible in the US is like this cleanup job, that tells us like, this is the front lines of the civil rights struggle and this is the edge and these people are, it's like, so heartwarming. These people are being protected and these incredibly disgusting, hated people are being protected. And then meanwhile, like nothing changes for those people, but the narrative changes. And then also you get a backlash. So then you also get all this anti-trans legislation. So like you not only have to live, and of course, backlashes, they're legal or whatever, they're also just cultural. It's like, suddenly people all over your state are talking about how horrible you are. And so then what happens to you at the welfare office or in the bathroom at McDonald's is like that much worse, specifically for those who are the most hated of the group, who are visibly trans, who are homeless, who are disabled, who are people of color, who are, like already disposable people, right? That harm doesn't fall upon like the people, like the protected white child, in the same way that it falls upon those who really reap that hatred. And so I just like that, the complexity, like, I mean, Eric's argument that things get worse when we're told they get better is so profound still, even though we've seen this, we could narrate all of the other fake progress of, the United States government supposedly protecting hated groups. We can see that for our whole lifetimes and beyond. It's just very powerful that the way that Eric tells those stories through these sites of violence, and really shows like how that works. And I just feel like I kind of can't get enough of that question because it's so profoundly opposite of what we are supposed to think about progress and the specific, like really wild, messed up role that like LGBT people play in this progress narrative right now about like how the US law is perfect, and especially the global narrative about how the US treats gay people right and other countries treat them bad, so we should bomb them. I mean, just like broader use of this politics that is so deeply harmful and utterly delivers nothing to most queer and trans people's well-being, and just how deep that is. Like, so the book is just deeply moving to me, and I like learned a ton of things I didn't know, and like felt more deeply things that I really care about, and then I feel like I've been traveling with Eric along for a long time. Like, when people do the work of a book, it's just like, and work on these ideas for so long and think about them so carefully, it's just like I feel so grateful for like that deeper level of understanding that I get out of reading it, even while I've been listening to Eric talk about these ideas for years in different contexts of friendship or of academia or in Eric's films, etc. So yeah, really grateful to be here.
Thank you all for those really, I just feel like my mind is racing. I'm like, I want to talk about like Black feminism and its conversations with trans and queer theory around ideas of futurity and living freedom now, right? Living a future freedom now. There's something about that I feel is so present in this work. And so maybe I'll shelf that for later. And Eric, I'd like to maybe bookmark that for you to come back to later. But I was also really struck in both Jules and Lavelle in your comments talking about the question of violence, right? And how Eric approaches this question in the book. And the book really, Eric, you're really insistent about kind of staying with the trouble of violence in the work. And, on the one hand, you sort of are, there's something, I think part of what's so moving about the work and the writing is how you hold these stories of violence with so much care. And there's a clear sort of deliberative process around kind of the ethics of narrating these scenes of anti-trans violence and like how to represent that violence and what we think are sort of the political, like what's the political payoff, right, of narrating these scenes of violence in this way. And so I wanted to ask, I think I wanted to start maybe with Lavelle about, your thoughts on kind of the ethics of narrativizing anti-trans violence and how we sort of bring these scenes into representation and how, most importantly, do we really remain accountable to the victims of these forms of anti-trans violence as we narrate these experiences?
Yeah, thank you, Courtney. That's a really good, well thought out formulation of questions that I'm excited to talk about. Of course, thinking about Eric's book, Atmospheres of Violence, violence is kind of the one of the main objects that's under review here. And about halfway through the book, maybe sooner than that, as I was reading, is when I realized, so we are thinking about violence, but we're thinking about violence in this very particular way so that we can see a very particular picture at the end of the book about what is the true task at hand, to borrow their language that they use sometimes in the book. So, but I think specifically with this this question about representation and how like the constant returning to the scene of violence and how you deal with it. I mean, I'm sure like many other people, I just based off of my training and when I read these texts, it makes me immediately think of Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten, who are talking to each other in some of their earlier texts about, recreating the scream, from one of the great, slave narratives of the time, I believe Frederick Douglass's, and how they both give kind of a meditation on, how do we do this? We're probably not going to do it the best way we could, but how do we discuss violence in a thorough and critical way in an attempt to get somewhere that doesn't still reproduce that violence, even though we're not coming into the scene of violence with the same expectations, the same politics, the same goals, or anything like that. And I think that here in Atmospheres of Violence, Eric has actually done a really good job of not only signaling that deep emotion that comes with having to address those kinds of things, but also I really appreciate what they say, which is just, I don't know, what we can do ultimately, but I'm going to sit in this violence and not reproduce violence where I can, but rather not let here, thinking specifically about the case of Dwana Johnson, who's incarcerated and then gets attacked by officers in the name of their self-defense. In that part of the book, in that scene, Eric says, it would be flattening to her image to not look. It would be almost as treating her as the non-image. It would be relegating her to that scene of the negative that is already being done by power forces and power structures, right? And so that ambivalence and lack of certainty of what to do, I think, indexes that affective relationship that we as scholars of the trans queer, ungovernable, of abolition and the end to these structures as they exist in service of something that might be better. I think it's a really well and effectively well done job of staying in the violence, staying with the violence, but for the use of actually demonstrating the kinds of violences happening here, and that those particular violences don't keep getting done. And it was a really big learning. It was a good learning moment for me as someone who is open and, I will talk about the murders of, anyone, but like trans women of color specifically, incarcerated women of color, though I don't post about it a lot in social media and things like that. But so it gave me a good chance to reflect on, what's the violence being done there in that schema, and then where's the repair attempting to be found so that these people don't just get relegated to the space of non-being because we refuse to look at them. So I think that's both important writerly practice for those of us, writing projects that think about death and think about violence in these kinds of ways and using these kinds of analytics. But it's also good for our own personal sense of self and the care and the intention that we bring to talking about these moments of violence in a way so that it doesn't just reproduce the social's need for violence to be talked about, especially violence that functions within the liberal state that Eric argues, doing a particular kind of work that maybe we on our end don't want it to be doing. So.
Others, please feel free to jump in on this question.
Okay, maybe I'll say a few words. And to tell the truth, I had really expected to experience the effect of wanting to close my eyes, of feeling compelled to look away. But Eric has so carefully considered the possible consequences of narrating violence in a particular way, the pitfalls of a politics of representation that assumes that seeing the violence will either be arousing or it will be spine-chilling. So what absolutely impressed me was that Eric has sort of created a register where this violence can be represented in a way that really makes us want to stay there, and not so much to move beyond it, but to see what is available to us if we don't turn away. And I don't know whether I had ever quite experienced that in the same way. I don't want to say that it's a meditative register, but it's a kind of reflective register that makes us aware that we cannot gloss over the violence. Whether it is state violence, stranger violence, intimate violence, self-inflicted violence. And, as someone who always likes to point out that Black trans women are consistently the targets of more forms of violence than any other population, it made me think more critically about this assertion that I so often make. And it made me think about it as, I guess, statistics, as a realm of statistics that actually prevents us from understanding, as Eric puts it, that violence is not antagonistic to the condition that we're thinking about, but rather it is a fundamental element. It's a structuring element. And that if we treat it as exceptional, and if we treat trans and queer people as the exceptional targets of this exceptional practice, then we don't grasp the nature of the democracy that we are so often compelled to desire despite itself. And I think you've accomplished something really remarkable, Eric, and I certainly hope that it allows us to move away from discussions about whether the violence should be narrativized or whether it should be left alone. But thank you so much. I feel as if I'm still reeling with the kind of effective response that your writing has called up in me, and it makes me want to rethink so many other conversations about violence.
I really appreciate what you just said, Angela, about what it felt like to read it, because I really avoid reading accounts of violence as much as possible, and then choose to read them where I really want to have that sober discernment and know it. But I try to avoid reading excessive accounts of violence, and I really experienced this book as like almost feels like it's like teaching us how to be with the realities of the violence in a way that is about sober discernment about the world in which we actually live and what this violence does, instead of just rehearsing it again, or rehearsing it for shock value, or rehearsing it to generate some kind of thin pity or some kind of thin outrage. It made me think a lot about how people are in denial about climate change. Like even people I love who would say climate change exists still don't want to actually think about how actually bad things are and what that might mean for our preparedness and for the urgency of our action. There's a kind of like look away. And it's like, I think that also happens with these kinds of violence. And it's like, Eric is the style of writing. And I think that this is a style that comes from, Eric, like your own practice of building a capacity to be with in sober reality. Like so much of my experience of you as someone who's intervened on my thinking has been about like being willing to look at like really how truly bleak everything is at a different level, and like letting me see it. And maybe I found your influence to be like sobering in that way again and again, like, and deeply radicalizing. And so I guess I feel like there's something about your practice that a kind of discernment you're able, and like being with, you're able to do. And then you wrote it that way, which is like so hard. I can't even imagine how you did that. And then I read it that way. And I'm curious, and so it just feels so different from the thing I constantly critique of like the overrepresentation of violence against hated groups and, marginalized people. It feels like it has a really different quality, and it like built a capacity in me. It was like a pedagogical experience for me. It's just really interesting and very moving.
Well, just to add to that, I think this is a really important line of thinking. And I think one of the riddles that we confront, if I could speak particularly to trans misogyny or racialized trans misogyny, is overexposure. It is this visual economy in which there has been an education in desire, the desire for images of suffering, violence, and death. And I think one of the ways that the book is sort of eclipsing a kind of standard antagonism between invisibility and visibility, or witnessing and ignoring, right, is that witnessing must witnessing requires an alternate pedagogy in order to build a capacity to witness effectively, and either, not to be moved in some 18th century Enlightenment or 19th century sentimental tradition of being moved, but also for those of us who feel implicated in the circulation of those images to not be destroyed by them. And similarly to a lot of you, I generally avoid consuming more accounts of violence than I would come across in my own life anyways. But I almost want to, make the case that part of what the book is doing is maybe shifting a little bit or putting pressure on the sort of visual regime itself. The idea that our job is not so much to see, with all of the kind of, implications that come with that grammar and that, sort of Western tradition of vision being equated with reason or mastery and the ableism bound up in it. But a sort of, I think a sort of pedagogy that begins with a question as complicated actually as what violence, what kind of violence, what kinds of violences, I think there has been a kind of characterizing of violence that is surely, one of the kind of derivative effects of liberal political culture, where we think violence is sort of a placeholder word sometimes, that there's so much violence, and it kind of flattens its differences and it flattens its different forms, right? And I think to use the example of transmisogyny, one of the things that's really powerful but difficult in the book, right, is understanding that something that has been concretized as being a problem of the individual, say in the trans panic defense, right, is actually nevertheless our window into understanding what it means to think of transmisogyny as constitutive, right, of the gendered order, of the racialized gendered order in which the United States, has come into being and helped construct this order in which trans women's existence is read as ontologically aggressive in a way that then allows the person who fantasizes that as threat to seek any revenge that they want, right? And I think this is where the concept of overkill, it's very difficult to sit with, but it's really compelling, right? The idea that, the violence that has been normalized against trans women of color and Black trans women is not content merely with extinguishing their life. It's a form of brutalization that has to go beyond a kind of, you're alive or you're dead, right? And I think that, again, the kind of question then is, well, what if we already live in a culture that has normalized the consumption of those images because the United States has normalized the consumption of images of Black death and suffering for so long, and transmisogyny becomes a kind of constitutive, way to represent that in one particular gendered register. And then the question is not so much like who needs to see this, or, how can we be moved by seeing it? Rather, we're way past that. Like that threshold was crossed so long ago that sort of, the ruse is everyone who's trying to put it back in front of us as if we haven't already dealt with that. And there's something that I found surprisingly, capacitating about that, I suppose, in the sense that, I think it asks this question about how we demand so much nonviolence from marginalized people. I mean, one thing I was thinking about is even how much queer and trans studies, right? And this is where I think the France Fanon in the book is so helpful. It's like anyone who has lived through colonialism or settler colonialism, or, the idea that if you experience extreme violence as structuring your life in the world, that your job is to never respond. And this sort of demand, the hagiographies that we perform on people like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, the complete denial of their material everyday lives and the struggles they were embedded in, just to sort of, sanctify them as if their value comes through what? Endurance, surviving for some amount of time. And as if that kind of, I think just this sort of strange moralizing impulse that queer and trans people, especially people of colors, kind of suffering is what validates their value to us. I mean, it's this sort of necropolitical logic that other people have written about very beautifully. But I think there's a sort of powerful, to me, defiance of that, right? And a suggestion that the people already subject to that violence, like there's no riddle. We're already living through it. If we're going to be waking up every morning. We've already figured out enough of a way to negotiate for that day, right? I mean, one of the things I have been a little bit kind of stuck with this semester teaching with students is, sometimes offering a difficult text, say from the mid-century or the 60s or the 70s, something that does include a lot of scenes of violence, and talking to students and kind of trying to dig in their sense of surprise in reading. And as I've sort of scratched at that, what are you surprised about? Some of it is sort of this sense that I'm getting from students that I'm just surprised that people experience that much violence and still had lives, still had lovers, still had parties, still, lived for decades, often into old age, still organized, didn't give up on their struggles, didn't give up on their communities. And I was trying to think about how that surprise is implanted, that it's itself an education, right? That is sort of, implanted in us from a young age, that is actually dependent on our constant consumption of a different narrative of violence, right? So that we are trained to actually consume it and be proximate to it, so we don't have to, so that we can also continue to be surprised by it, right? I mean, it's just this very vicious cycle. And there's just a really interesting kind of disruption, I think, a kind of centrifugal force in this book that starts to unwind that, right? And so, whereas I'll say in the first chapter, I was tightened up, I was kind of, I was really, really having a hard time sitting with some of the violent scenes. And I had felt a kind of, I don't know, it's just I have fentanyl in the mind, but a kind of relaxation of the muscles towards the end of the book that felt like phenomenologically instinctive and important in some way. And this kind of thinking about this whole array of people that we meet in the book who certainly, experienced and endured a lot of violence, but also responded and were active in response to it and asked for people to be militant and asked for people to take up the struggle along their side, right? And not people who just sort of ascetically endured it in one sort of palatable kind of, sanctified or saintly sort of way. So I don't know, I've kind of spun out here, but I just really want to underline that there's something that really hit differently for me than other scholarship that I've read that I think generally will just try to overcompensate for the perceived exceptional violence directed, say, at trans women of color by over-idealizing them and saying that, well, they're the most oppressed, but they're also the most revolutionary. And to me, it's a closed loop of knowledge that, around Sylvia and Marsha, let's say, it started to form in the 70s. You can read gay liberation, pamphlets from the 70s that say we need to consider Sylvia, right? It's the same grammar of utopia to come if only we idealize these people who we didn't stand up for in the first place, right? And in that case, it's really on their backs of those gay liberationists in the 70s. They really were the ones that did that selling out, right? But here we are having inherited that. And I just think it's really curious, right? The way that kind of mainstream LGBT political discourse has worked so hard to platform trans women of color in this recuperative mode that I think, unfortunately, has really pulled us even further away from the kind of questions of witnessing and capacitation that we're talking about here tonight. So I really encourage people to think with that and really read carefully the introduction to the book, which I will say, sorry, last thing, I know I'm talking a long time, but I really think it's one of the best treatments I've seen of Sylvia and Marsha in any scholarly work that actually really does refuse to idealize them in the name of our contemporary political desires and asks what actual projects and needs did they have during their lives that were unfinished, but that were also collective and exceeded them. And so we don't arrive at Sylvia and Marsha as saints that we have to elevate as icons, but we actually think of them as complex individuals who leave unfinished business that it behooves us to take up.
Thank you for that. I wanted to offer one more question to our panelists and then open the conversation up. There's been a lot of conversation in the comments and people have many, many questions for the panelists and for Eric. So I just want to offer this last question and then move into that conversation. And especially, Jules, as you were making reference to Eric's engagement with the work of Unknown in the piece, it seems really appropriate to end on this last question. And so, in the book, Eric, you really engage with multiple genealogies of critical theory, ranging from Frantz Fanon to Benjamin to Sylvia Wynter. And the book also, perhaps more importantly, understands people organizing in prisons, sex workers, trans artists, and street queens to be offering radical theorization that's as important as the work of these critical thinkers that you engage with. And so how do you see this, or other people who are on the panel, can you talk about how you see this book being useful beyond the academy, being useful in social movements, being useful for organizers and people who are doing anti-trans revolutionary work on the ground? How do you see this work traveling beyond the walls of the academy? I'll leave that open.
I'll say a couple of things. I think that realistically, we who write books know that people mostly don't read books. So, let's all be real about that. What I think is likely to happen, which is what happens with all the rest of the books we all write that we hope are helpful, is that people will talk about the ideas in it together. And I think that the ideas in it are just really pushing this conversation a lot further. And I'm just already, there's the pictures I've taken of different pages and emailed them friends. Like, did you know this history? Did you know this thing? I think probably how a lot of this will travel, just being real, that a lot of this stuff travels in little pieces. And I think that people will take chapters out of this book and use them in classrooms, which is really great, because then people can be forced to read them by their teachers, just because that's how it is now. And I hope that's not too silly or rude in some way to say, but just my own experience of writing books and thinking that, let's be real about that. But I think this book is so densely full of accounts that are just that change how we think about everything. I think a lot of it was just being discussed about, even about Sylvia and Marsha. And so I imagine that's how it will circulate, is that people will be like, oh my gosh, that page I read, or that, whether they read it in school or whether they picked it up on their own and are talking about it to friends who are less likely to read this book or a book. I feel like that's, nowadays when we write things, they get passed around in a different way. Also the ways that we used to pass things around in zines, by photocopying one page of the book, or, but I think in particular people pass things around by taking little parts of it and putting it on social media. And I think a lot of that will influence conversations and just talking to each other about the ideas. I think there's something interesting happening now where reading books is maybe harder than it used to be because people's attention spans are shorter. But also I think radical books are really having a popular moment too. And so I'm not sure how that all relates, but I think that this book is part of that moment. People are asking new questions about abolition, new questions about anarchism, that this book has so much to say about. So I feel like it's going to be shaping conversations a lot.
I can actually imagine this book being read by a reading group inside of a prison. And, I think sometimes we assume that just because a book is not an easy read, that people who are not accustomed to academic study are not going to sit with it and spend time with it. And I'm thinking about the fact that, Foucault argued that he wrote Discipline and Punish for prisoners. The reason he wrote the book was to allow them to engage in discussions about the consequences of their own condition. But, that's neither here nor there. But I do believe that reading groups inside prisons can be encouraged to read this book. It takes time to read it. Just as Eric is asking us to be willing to stay with the violence, to stay with the problems, who has more time to do that than people who are doing time? So I really want to think about how we might encourage the reading of this book in prisons. And I'm actually thinking about places where there's a connection between a class inside a university and a class inside a prison. I was down at Pomona last week, and they have an ongoing group that takes place over Zoom, where people in prison engage with people who are in the classroom. And as a matter of fact, I may ask one of the professors to consider this for the reading lists. But I think this is also a book that can teach people how to think. And if it takes a year to get through it, that's okay, and especially people who have the time might be able to instruct us in ways that might not otherwise be possible. So I want to see activists reading this book. I want to see them maybe taking, one chapter at a time and spending, spending a month on a chapter or more. And I think this can help to challenge the assumption that only those who've had a certain kind of academic preparation are capable of engaging with difficult ideas.
Thank you. Any others? All right. Well, then I want to shift gears a little bit and open it up to questions and comments that we've gotten from the audience. There are quite a few questions. And so I'll start from the very beginning. Our first question comes from Ava, who says, I've heard the term ungoverned a couple of times during this panel, and I'm curious to know what the meaning of it is in this context. Can anyone elucidate?
Well, I guess I can try. First, thank you all for that really meaningful and engaged and beautiful, sets of reflections on the text. It really, feeling a lot of things over here. As you all know, I'm a triple Cancer. There's no escaping it. So in the text, becoming ungovernable, which is the coda, right? That's a phrase that became really popularized in street-based, mostly anarchist, but other forms of political organizing. About 15 years ago, the slogan became more and more popular. And I think what it does for me, or does two things. First is that ungovernable is actually a legal designation, as I was saying before, for children, right? It's essentially what happens oftentimes is if a parent or guardian does not want to be legally culpable for their children, that they then ask a judge to have a charge of ungovernability placed upon them, which relinquishes their responsibility for those children. And then what happens is that they're oftentimes placed in juvenile jail or something like that. And of course, this disproportionately happens to trans and queer gender nonconforming people who have an antagonistic at best relationship with their parents or guardians, right? And so there's that actual legal definition, right? In all the ways that then people build, mesmerizing social worlds out of that unlivable condition is something that I'm always trying to track. Again, pointing back to the reality that, these practices are not, as a number of y'all have said, only something that exists in the future, but are indeed here and now. And, perhaps one of our jobs is to pay close attention so that we might understand them, to support them, right? The things that are already happening. So there's that side of it. And then the other side of it is actually about, a kind of commitment, either conscious or not, towards being against in every way and in every instance the crushing violence of the settler state, right? It's and of course it's not about being a perfect pure political subject, but about radically dreaming and indeed producing the world that's going to offer us something more than the death world that we have now, right? And there's again so many incredibly important historical and ongoing examples of that. Right. And so in the book, I think about, Miss Major, who changes all of this film that Tourmaline directed, where she changes her identification, then changes it back, then changes it back again. Right. And she's just constantly changing it around. And she's like, fuck you. I'm going to be whoever I'm going to be. I'm not actually chasing the state and demanding that they recognize me. I'm actually interested in the total destruction of the state form that demands recognition as the precondition of life, right? And so to me, that's why ungovernability is so important.
Thank you for that, Eric. I love that. There's two questions here that I want to toss out to the panelists. The first one is from Joanne Barker, who writes, "Wonder how the state and its corporations benefit from the violence perpetuated by its failed promises of recognition and inclusion, and if or how it is possible to interfere with that benefit, or I guess how those institutions benefit from trans death." Our next question is from Ames Simmons, who writes, "What are the panelists' thoughts about the ways that Transgender Day of Remembrance is observed, setting aside one day per year to acknowledge violence against transgender people?" Jules, you look pensive.
Wow, they're tough questions. I mean, which is not to say that they're bad questions. On the contrary, it's interesting. There's a kind of, I'm not sure I have anything smart to say about Trans Day of Remembrance other than like, it's tricky, but I think one thing I might say, particularly in the context of this pandemic, is how pernicious the denial of grief's conversion into militancy can be. The idea that grief is a private matter, loss is private, or also the refusal to reckon with loss as a refusal to reckon with political economy and the actual calculations that have been transacted to justify mass forms of death that are also disproportionate in their effects. And so to me, so I think there are probably all sorts of ways we could think about TDOR, in the broader context of the uptake of LGBT, especially T, sort of forms of death and of suffering, in a kind of neoliberal culture that imagines that, the centering of that or its visibility is somehow in of itself important and sort of, again, tries to depoliticize. But I think, in terms of, I don't know, I'm interested, the question about the state and corporation, it's like there are ways that, capital certainly accumulates, through immiseration on mass scales. And, there's historical antecedents here that are taken up in the book, for example, right? How the formation of a capitalist world economy out of the transatlantic slave trade and out of settler colonialism and the expropriation of resources. But I guess I kind of also think that one of the riddles that we often confront, and I think that we're left with precious few useful tools to understand, is that, like the state is not a person. I mean, the state is personified often in the way that we talk about it, or capital is personified, but these are not people. They are not individual agents. And so they need not be logical or have motive or purpose, right? And I think that, I don't know, I think it's interesting. I see this a lot, for example, around like, conversations about prison that are hanging on the edges of or in the neighborhood of becoming abolitionists, but won't go there. Same with police, right? Where it's like, well, America only has this prison industrial complex because private prisons make so much money. And it's like, well, I mean, by that calculus, like not really, right? Like most prisons aren't private, and that's not like the entire economy depends on imprisonment, right? The generation of value isn't so intentional, and it can be diffuse and contradictory, and that the set of contradictions, right, is not inimical to the functioning of the system, but it's precisely how they regenerate themselves. So I don't know, it's just sort of interesting. I think we have this sense of extraction because we experience it, right? That there's a lot of extraction through liberal institutions and violence, right? But it's not always obvious to me that it directly benefits right? A different group in so obvious a way that like I'm taking this from you and giving it to someone else. There are larger calculuses that I think are more difficult to reckon with because they're so impersonal and aggregate, right? In a sort of biopolitical, for example, concept of racism where, you know, internal race warfare inside the nation is a kind of purification ideal. And so killing is to regenerate the lives of those whose lives are valued. But the transaction is never so one-to-one in reality, right? I think of that, again, to come back to that example of trans youth, you know, the white trans child whose legal access to healthcare is imperiled is not like, you know, it's not like the copay comes from the Black trans child who has been, you know, suspended from school and has been fed. And so, you know, some of this I think is sort of reckoning with how the liberal political grammar invites us to personify, right? These vast structures of subjectification and to think of them as motivated by animus, right? So again, I think the difference between thinking of like the logic of trans panic as something that you know, an individual person who might secretly themselves be queer or trans engages in because they have some internal conflict they can't resolve versus the logic of trans panic as the structuring transmisogyny of the entire social, right? And it's harder to wrestle with impersonality. I think it's really challenging to understand that people's lives are ruined and are ended and people live in misery for no reason at all. For no purpose, right? I mean, certainly it enriches some people, but the logic of capitalism is just widespread immiseration. It's not more efficient. It's not better at technological advance. It's not better at producing outcomes even for the privileged. You know, there are other ways to organize the world that would be infinitely better by any measure because we'd be redesigning those measures. So I don't know. That's sort of, I'm not sure that's an answer to the question, but I think it's one of the kind of impulses or one of the sort of offerings from the book that emerges really clearly for me that I just feel is so helpful at this moment when a lot of people feel burnt out, I think, on wrestling with the state because the state, you know, is both in crisis but benefiting from its own crisis to extend, you know, powers of police and surveillance and you know, disaster is often the best thing for institutions in peril, right? So yeah, I don't know. Anyways, that was just one place that I was going.
Wow, I love that. Just thinking about like there's something that's it's somewhat unsatisfying thinking that there's no sort of a clear benefit in the enactment of these forms of violence, and that there's the nature of state violence on so many levels, there is a kind of arbitrary logic that is really hard to sit with. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask one question. There's a few, but there's one in particular I wanted to surface and maybe give you, Eric, an opportunity to talk about this and any others, maybe Lavelle, who is writing a lot about violence. Cleo Sadie asks, how does remembering the dead impact your writing process? And I'm particularly struck by this question because I feel like I think about the dead and ancestors a lot in my own sort of scholarly writing and creative practice. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this, Eric.
I mean, I think for me, in turning back, the way that this is connected to the question of representation itself and not just representing violence, because representation, as I argue in the book, is always an accumulative process, right? So then how do we think outside or beside or whatever word we might use the question of violence itself? You know, I think one of the reasons that this book took so long is because of my attempt, perhaps somewhat successfully, I'm sure incredibly failed, to ask myself time and again, what does it mean to do justice with and for these people who were lost to the world, right? As an unanswerable question, as a methodologically unpure question, but as a kind of, I don't know, a manifesto, a love letter, I don't know what it is. Because for me, you know, staying in that place is the only way that we might even approximate the question of ethics when the ethical itself has shown itself to be already destroyed, right? We're just in the kind of place of the corporeal and of these ongoing histories and of their seemingly never-ending archive, right? I mean, I look at this project, it started when I was, from personal experiences, but also just like collecting, a long time ago. So actual newspaper clippings, and the file just never stopped growing. That said, I mean, I think that there's, what does it mean to attempt to open oneself up to being, in relation as best we can with those that are lost? And what does it mean to also just let people be, right? I think that there's this other way in which, people are trying to constantly dig up those that have had really horrible ends, right? And what does it mean to just let people rest, right? How can we hold that space as well? And so it's not, it's a very incomplete answer, but you can see throughout the text, I try to think of ambivalence as an actual way to be with these, right? So it's not like I can't decide, but it's the impossibility of decision itself.
Oh, thank you for that. We have one more question from Anna Ing, who writes, I'm wondering if anyone can address the violence and death of assimilation. They say, I do not mean to diminish the reality, tragedy, and power of this disciplining of physical violence by asking this question, but I'm wondering, how do we analyze and assess the psychic violence of assimilation and inclusion? And I'll leave that open for whoever would like to take that question.
I can take that one. How do we analyze and assess violence in that way? Again, really good and thorough questions. I think that the questions that have been put before us tonight evidence the, tense relationship that Eric's book sees in everything, the world in the book and us in the world and structures of power and those of us who are attempting to be ungovernable, tension and irresolution, I feel, is the affective mode throughout the majority of the book. And I think how I would answer that question as someone who's, very openly still trying to figure it out. I think that not just the theoretical frameworks of thinking about violence, so when Eric is bringing in Fanon and Benjamin and people like that, not only do those parts of the book help give us a language and an orientation towards understanding that helps further the projects that we want to be invested in that are considered with violence against marginalized groups, but I think what also Eric's doing in the book is modeling this kind of affective, it seems like I don't want to say tiptoe, but it's a fully careful, considerate, empathetic, and, just a really careful processing and examination of their lives. Like they use them, what seems to me, as someone who's also writing about scenes of violence against people like Ashley Diamond and Cece McDonald and Ilan Nettles, it's, you do get tired of reading those stories over and over in particular ways. And there are moments when they get re-narrated and different aspects of the case are being looked at. So it's not just, the normative anti-trans, anti-Black technologies that we bring to those kinds of cases, like what the woman was wearing and just where she was or where her profession was, but rather here we have the opportunity to put that to the side mostly and to really, and I like how Eric even says it, sit in the violence, sit in the moments with these people. It feels almost like something I've been saying to myself and to my partner as I've been reading this book is damn, I really have to read this book with Eric in my mind at the same time, because on my own it's hard, it just honestly is very hard. It's a very difficult book to read because of what's under review here, but But what I think we come out with is a renewed sense and a renewed ability of how to walk through that violence and what that means, and how to represent that violence and what that actually means for us here. I think that Eric has laid out some very clear goals, and other people's works has too, like Jules and Dean also in their work have established modes of reading and modes of encountering the archive that doesn't leave us completely devastated or completely without, hope for better or hope for more. But, all those invitations to those archives, I think, offer us a chance to rethink the entire learning project that we're going into. Like, what is it we exactly want to know? And then the last thing I'll say, too, is I appreciate this book in particular because as a literary scholar, a life writing scholar, I, all throughout my PhD, wanted to avoid, as much as I could, moments where I had to reread or see or think about or talk about Black trans women, being harmed or dead. And not just because of my own positionalities, but also just because of I'm a Pisces, so I don't have the emotional bandwidth to constantly be dealing with these things. But however, the joy and the light at the end of the tunnel that I kind of imagine Eric's books to be for me, especially as I'm writing my own book, mostly on violence and representation, is that there's a way for us to step back and to really take all these different moving parts into consideration, the showing of violence, the logics of the state, the contradictory nature of those operations, and leave both feeling a little, sad, like that this stuff still happens and that, that under present circumstances, those things aren't going to go anywhere, but that we are able to, if we ask the right questions and we pursue the right questions for the right reasons. And I really felt the whole time with Eric reading this book, like me and Eric are in struggle with these people at the same time we're reading. And that doesn't mean that we are actually literally going through the same things that they're going through, because we're not, but rather I think an evolving collective politic on the ends of trans queer subjects that is attempting to identify the state and identify things that are harmful or can be violent as something that can be read and understood, and then themselves as something to be read and understood, but not along the terms that we've, of course, been given, but rather as something that interrupts, that can reform, that can make power pivot, that can do all these things. I think that this book captures all these different actors in a really nuanced way. And I'm really excited to take that nuance into my own writing and, hopefully write a dissertation about Black trans women that doesn't have to reproduce so much violence necessarily, but that rather provides a path for those imagining those other life worlds that could totally possibly exist outside of this schema. So,
Lavelle, thank you for that. I know we'll all be looking forward to your forthcoming work, and it's such a privilege to have been able to facilitate this conversation with many scholars whose work is on heavy rotation in my own classes and in my own work, and encountering new scholars who are really just like moving the field of trans studies in some really important and necessary directions. And so I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, for celebrating Eric Stanley and this just like beautiful, heartbreaking, powerful work, Atmospheres of Violence. I'm still like working to find the language to describe my own like intensely visceral response to this work, but it really is a triumph, and I think something that you should be incredibly proud of, and that is so welcome in the movements that we support and that we care about. And it offers us some really useful blueprints for imagining a future beyond kind of the state and liberal recognition, being able to imagine freedom in different, more liberatory ways. So thank you, Eric, for your work. Thank you to all of our panelists. Jules Gill Peterson, Lavelle Ridley, Dr. Angela Davis, Dean Spade. Thank you all for being here. Have a good night.
We are are living in an age of plutonymy, where monetary controls agronomy. Too many therapists, not enough scientists. Guess you care about yourself more than the environment. Mother Earth, yeah, can you hear her crying, man? Volcanoes, tornadoes, all these wildfires, man. Modern day colonial explorers got a higher plan. Control the ladder to success, so know what climbs it, man. This is classism and fascism, I'm that rhythm. So much division deriving all from the caste system. The sole purpose of banks is to get cash in them. I guess they really don't want us being compassionate. Resources, they are trying to ration them. Resources, why they keep on extracting them. Bang the drum of plutonymy, eliminate the medicine man, build a pharmacy. And yo, then they call that modernity, trying to modernize and colonize our currency. Yo, and yo, the Inca never knew poverty. Do we really need money? What's the idea of property? All I try to do, yeah, is just speak honestly. All I hear on the mainstream radio station is misogyny or materialism, deriving from corporate governance. Feel like every country in the world is a corporate government. Another takedown letter, so they call it fake news. Trump's campaign was based off lies and post-truths. So much global imbalances from propaganda. There is pollution from consumerism. How we gonna handle? Think of everything in the supermarket and then up in the landfill. Then we breathe that air, so just stand still. Capitalism does not function for the greater good. I can't explain, yo, I wish I would. And the things that I say are not meant to be funny, cause you are just another monetary dummy.
Scum, filth, degenerate, viperous, murdering, crash, commie government.
Why do immigrants immigrate? Economic inequality. So I wonder, why is there so much anti-immigration policies trying to maintain managerial aristocracy? Cause when you think about it, this ain't really a democracy. Globalization is just like gentrification. It's got us patiently waiting for all this modernization. They close the bodega to build the Whole Foods. Call us Latinos, then cut funds from our schools. Trying to take dreams away from our youth. Hopefully this revolution televised soon. Can I get a vote from a super delegate? Most people's vote are really just irrelevant. Materialize the dream and then they start selling it. Visualize the scheme and then they don't let it slip. Most people are just stuck in their technologies, trying to see past the screens, focus on the problem. See, I am a student teacher of epistemology, cause I be living in a state of plutonymy.